Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Nora, the Interim Executive Director at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we talk with practitioners, academics, and faith leaders at the intersection of environmental justice, climate, COVID-19 pandemic, and other justice issues of our time. And this morning, I'm excited because we have on a friend of Gipple, but also a good friend of mine and a hometown colleague, I'll say, Anton Flores-Maisonet. Anton, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully I'm not the something stronger. I got coffee, but not.
Anton, you're the founding director of Causa Alterna and the Friend in Residence with the Atlanta Friends Meeting. And so I'll pass it to you to tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into the work that you're doing now.
Oh wow, that's a question.
And you can keep it brief because I'm going to dive into some other things.
Yeah, so academically, my background is in social work, but my wife and I adopted a child 20 years ago, Jairo, from Guatemala, and I'm Puerto Rican, and we just decided it was going to be really important that as we adopted our son, to not only adopt our son but adopt a culture, and so we began to really fully immerse ourselves. Both in opportunities to travel and serve in Guatemala, particularly through a Mennonite seminary there, but then also to befriend a number of Guatemalan immigrants. And that happened primarily through a Spanish language church that we began to attend. And that was really transformational for us and for opening up our eyes to seeing, how this pretty invisible segment of the community where we were living was living, and then much less than to understand and receive hospitality from their families. As when we traveled to Guatemala, we began to visit the sending communities of our migrant brothers and sisters.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for joining us again. You started to talk a little bit about this, but I wonder if you could dive in a little bit more on your faith background and how that background over time has informed your work and thoughts, particularly about kind of creation care and the environment and environmental justice.
Well, I am a kind of a person whose faith has continued to evolve, and I've come from a Catholic family, but we moved to Georgia when I was 10, and we were not regularly attending any Catholic institutions at that time, and the Baptist had a bus that picked up children, so I got immersed into kind of a fundamentalist evangelical world, but also very early on, the impulse of justice was something that was, I don't know why or how, kind of mystically was steep within me. I mean, as a matter of fact, like in elementary school, I saw the movie Gandhi, and it's still my favorite movie of all time. And so the way in which I understand kind of that Gandhian impulse of nonviolence, of being in harmony, with all living things and in sync with the world, I think began for me to kind of make these connections with environmental justice, and then, as I stated, that the travels to Guatemala and seeing how just a very short plane trip away there is a vast different reality, and one that is subjugated and subject to policies, corporate policies, government policies, their government, our government, demands for mineral resources, demands for monocultural, crops like coffee in Guatemala. So, and so maybe that's something stronger we're wanting today is justice in that coffee. But yeah, I think that as that continued to develop, I began to become aware of other streams of the Christian tradition. I still spend significant times with Anabaptist congregations, and we formed an intentional community where we were living as a faith community, but in an intentional way with immigrants from Central America and Mexico. And then now, as you stated, making my home, like literally, physically, with Quakers at the Atlanta Friends Meeting. And so kind of returning to some of that contemplative tradition that even my Catholic background really fostered within me, so that my activism and my engagement is rooted deeply in a well of spiritual foundation.
Can you expand a little bit about on how that the sort of spirit and practices of contemplation and perhaps some of these other spiritual practices inform you and kind of support you in your activism work?
Yeah. I think like as we think about environmental justice, I have to be confessional, maybe because I was a social worker, and my impulse into going into social work was more because I wanted to work cross ethnically, and I was really concerned about the impacts of the poor and the marginalized, but hadn't really made the connections globally about how climate change is also a form of marginalization. Um, and so once I started making those connections, and then once I started, realizing that for me to be able to sustain my commitment to hopefully embody something radical, I mean, that's my my bent is often to want to incarnate, and not just work for an organization that's progressive or advocate for a policy that's progressive, but actually figure out some way to embody that alternative. That's the name Casa Alterna, wanting to be an embodiment of that alternative. So to be able to sustain that, I realized that the contemplative life was going to be critical to doing that. Two things: the contemplative life and a community, but a community with the marginalized. Those two things, I think, have really been formational in me understanding that. So when I think about the contemplative life, I mean, to me, that's also a part of like resisting this consumer culture. So whether it's Sabbath keeping, or whether it is, a life of solidarity that leads to simplicity. I mean, to me, those are contemplative acts that allow me to know that I always have enough, that I can live out of that theology of enough, because the alternate, whether I'm conscious of it or not conscious of it, is fueling an economic system that continues to put the lives of millions and billions in jeopardy. And so it's a gift when I can see and think about, whether it's through the Christian lens or through other lenses, like Thich Nhat Hanh, just reminding me that I can't pretend to be a part of making the world a more peaceful place if I'm not also seeking to actively build that peace that is within myself.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so I draw inspiration and attempt the best I can, or attempt to release myself the best I can, so as to enable that peace to flow from within, as I seek to be a part of, making a more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, as Charles Eisenstein says.
Yeah, this may connect with that same sentiment, but you had mentioned kind of early on some connections with Mennonite communities when you were younger, and obviously that has kind of come full circle. Now you're in residence with the Friends meeting, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about how maybe the ideals of peace churches perhaps intersect with that.
Yeah. So again, like I said, there was always, I was always this kind of wannabe Gandhian Christian, whatever that means, from early on. And maybe because it was Gandhi, and maybe because my bent towards social justice came out of the academic, the social work side of me, and I was in these churches that were much more kind of focused on otherworldly things, that salvation was this otherworldly kind of concept, that I always felt like there was this disconnect between my passions, my charism, and my theology. But it was a post 9/11 world that actually kind of allowed me to go deeper and get to know some of the peace churches. I was actively involved with Christian peacemaker teams, who, and one of the places where I specifically would spend time with them was in Colombia, where we would see farmers being displaced, not one part because of the civil unrest, but another part was the production of palm oil, and the way that was leading to deforestation and displacement of peoples. And so it became a home for me to understand, like, some of the, at least the Anabaptist, centralities of saying that, Jesus is the center of our faith, that community is the center of our life, and that reconciliation, or I would say justice, is the center of our mission. And then now to have that fully complemented by, by Quakers who have this long tradition of being a witness to simplicity and sustainability, of peacemaking, of integrity in their life, of seeing community as this global reality, and then also of equality. I mean, I am just so thrilled and honored to kind of continue to learn from these streams of what what Richard Foster, an evangelical Quaker, calls these streams of living water.
Can you tell us a bit? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, Casa Alterna, and what it is, how it came to be.
Yeah, so I was teaching social work or human services at LaGrange College and left that position in 2006. By then, we had already started a cooperative housing relationship with one family from Mexico. And by cooperative, what I was talking about was trying to, again, small scale, often very much inspired by kind of the Catholic worker movement and these notions of doing great deeds, small deeds, but with great love. So really personalizing these commitments. So we, in 2002, purchased a home for dear friends of ours, Arturo and Norma, who we met through that Spanish congregation. But we decided that from day one that we would cooperatively own this home together, that we would extract the wealth accumulation of a landlord profit and instead share in this together. Then by 2006, I left academia and really wanted to focus in on two aspects of what would become Alterna. One is the outward kind of accompaniment work of doing mercy and justice with immigrants, both in the local community of LaGrange where we were living, but then that was also the same time that Stewart Detention Center opens up a private for-profit detention center in what was once beautiful timberland, gets opened up down just to the south of us. So to be that kind of outward focus, but to also, again, model this alternative model of how both citizens and non-citizens can live together interdependently by fostering an intentional community. And so over time that grew, and we still have 4, although I'm no longer in LaGrange, we still have 4 immigrant families that are part of that cooperative housing. They will probably actually all own their homes mortgage-free in less than 5 years. And at its peak, we were about 9 households that all lived in the same neighborhood and had some shared spiritual rhythms together, whether that was praying together in the mornings, or having meals together in the evenings, or gathering for a time of worship and study, or just doing the beautiful shared life and some economic sharing, some food, we would, growing of some food, raising of some chickens, just things that really made our scale of economies really, really small. I think I've talked to you before about this notion of watershed discipleship. And that's not a concept that I can take credit for. That goes to Ched Myers and others, but we were stumbling into that, and it wasn't us coming from kind of a intellectual capacity. It was us following the lead of these immigrants who always just kind of instinctively, because of their rural backgrounds, just understood the primacy of their watershed. And so our life became focused, locally. I remember Charlotte, my wife, and I even taking an experiment where we said we wanted to live within 1 mile of our home. And that meant by living 1 mile, we were trying to say, how can we do our commerce, get our sustenance and get our relationships within a 1 mile radius of our home. And it was a fascinating and challenging and not always successful, but a wonderful, experiment that made us think about what then we would understand as this framework of watershed discipleship, that number one, this was a watershed moment, right? And that number two, we needed to actually understand what it meant to love our neighbors and view that within the context of our watershed and how our watershed, sustains our life and the lives of our neighbors.
Yeah, that has so many, the ways in which intentional communities exist have so many connections with sort of smaller carbon footprints being more just and equitable with the land and with each other. I wonder if you could talk about maybe what learnings come out of that intentional community. What's the value and that 1 mile radius? Um, what does that
Yeah,
push you to do?
I mean, I think that so that experiment, again, kind of ramped up for 4 years, kind of slowly, and then for 10 years, really kind of like hit its stride. So it was about this 14-year, one generation experiment. And I'll tell you, I mean, the capacity of what small scales of intentional communities can do is incredible. I mean, and as it relates to environmental justice, I mean, of course, it took a lot of us a while to undo the hyper individualism of this culture. But once we started hitting that stride, and once we started realizing, I never, the 26 years that I lived in LaGrange, never ever owned a lawnmower. I mean, just as a small example to say, like, I would just always position myself in such a way that I would, ask a neighbor, and I would help that neighbor, with the maintenance cost and make sure that I bought the fuel for it, what have you. So, we started then with this community expressing like what that could look like with vehicles. We started wondering, what might that look like in terms of health coverage? Norma, who I mentioned, was undocumented and uninsured and on dialysis. And so, we began to kind of share that burden together. But it also meant, especially as a faith community, where we didn't have the overhead of buildings and energy usage for buildings and salaries for buildings, that this small little group of really committed, kind of just little, very small group. I mean, we built 4 homes with Habitat for Humanity in a sister community in Guatemala. We added on to the school. We built an additional classroom to the school and some other improvements to the school. We did road improvements for this coffee growing region where it was pretty treacherous roads to get up and down. And so just this very small experiment was able to, I think, really lighten, the carbon footprint, to see folks just walking to our gatherings and enhance. It also enhanced the sense of neighborhood, not just our 9 families, but we were intentionally in what had been historically kind of a marginalized part of LaGrange, and we were actually, with the cooperative housing, doing some things that would even buffer kind of the tendencies towards gentrification. But I would say that, that our presence even enriched the sharing and just the neighborliness within the neighborhood. It was truly, I don't want to romanticize things, I think, but I mean,
that's a common intentional community problem.
isn't it? And it was the hardest, most frustrating moments. But in hindsight, when we've left, I mean, if I could get other folks on here, I think we would all say, like, there was something divine about it that we long for, that we miss, and that you just can't reconstruct. Anywhere. So if it's utopian, utopia is a lot of hard work and a lot of sweat and tears. But in hindsight, you realize that it's a gift, and I think that's a part of the contemplative, is to realize, that the text I'm going to read. I've been trying to hint at all these things. Is like to say, like, is if we only knew the gift. What these things are too, and the gift of nature, and the gift of a theology of enough, and the gift of actually loving our neighbors in the global sense. I mean, these are all gifts.
Yeah, we dove in without your offering your reading. I got too excited. So this is probably a good time to do that. So why don't we do that?
So I think, and actually it's kind of cool because I've been hinting at it as we've gone along. So maybe it'll make sense now.
You're just trying to remind me that I haven't done what I'm supposed to do.
Well, anyway, so I'm going to read from the Inclusive Bible. This is the 4th chapter of John. I'm going to read the first 10 verses. When Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard he was attracting and baptizing more disciples than John, though it really, wait, let me start over. When Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard he was attracting and baptizing more disciples than John, though it was really not Jesus baptizing, but his disciples, he left Judea and returned to Galilee. This meant that he had to pass through Samaria. He stopped at Sychar, a town in Samaria, near the tract of land Jacob had given to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. Jesus, weary from the journey, came and sat by the well. It was around noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The disciples had gone off to town to buy provisions. The Samaritan woman replied, "You're a Jew. How can you ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink?" Since Jews had nothing to do with Samaritans. Jesus answered, "If you only recognize God's gift and who it was that is asking you for a drink, you would have asked him for a drink instead, and he would have given you living water."
Yeah, so what's your, I know you have a lot to say about this passage, so I'll invite you to kind of elaborate a bit on why you chose to bring that and how it relates to some of the things that you've been hinting at this morning.
Yeah. Well, as it relates first to migrate in my life with migrants, so I have to kind of say that I will, kind of give my perspective through my lens here. Is that, the New York Times recently had an article that talked about how 1% of the world is a barely livable hot zone that currently, and that estimates are that in 50 years that portion could go up to 19% of the globe, and that would be the lands of billions of people. And so they painted two scenarios as it relates to Central America and Guatemala, again, where I have most of my relationships. One scenario is that then drought and food insecurity will drive people from Mexico and Central America out of their rural communities and out of the countryside, and that they'll first go, and this is already happening, to large cities, Guatemala City, Mexico City, what have you. And that what you'll see is rapid and overwhelming urbanization. And eventually they'll go further north, and this is already happening. And that's why we have our maquilas, or our sweatshops, in the northern regions of Mexico. But this projection shows that under this scenario, that by the year 2050, so 30 years from now, that we will see migrants entering into the United States from Central America and Mexico at about the rates of 1.5 million migrants per year. And that then by 2020, and that in just 5 years from now, that number will be 700,000 per year. So that's one scenario, that climate change pushes people off their land, and we will see large influxes of migrants coming here. And I would say that is some of what is already pushing migrants now, and these families that we're having. The community that I'm in, again, of El Sauce is a coffee growing region, and I have seen what Roya, this fungus, has been doing to their coffee plant productions. And then this year with the pandemic, the price of coffee dropping. So how do they remain economically viable? They don't have more land. Land is a major justice issue in Central America, and access to land. And so these forces of migration have been existing, but will only escalate. That's one scenario. The other scenario, though, is that the United States hardens its borders. So like that still happens down there, but the United States does not allow this 700,000 or this 1.5 million migrants to enter into the United States. And instead people are turned back. And we've been getting glimpses of this right now, right? And so we have basically refugee camps right on the border. This is something we are seeing right now. And yet economic growth in Central America will slow down as a result, because remittances, the money that immigrants send back to their families in Central America is the #1 source of revenue for these countries. So economic slowdown, both in terms of exports and then in terms of remittances, most importantly, because of a more militarized border. And so then because of lack of education, lack of family planning, and lack of options, you will see populations in Central America surge, and these rural populations will not have a place to go to. So these rural populations will see their birth rates rise, and what we'll see is worsening absolute poverty, worsening hunger, something that is already happening in Guatemala, all because of hotter weather and access to less and less water. And so these are the options that are before us. And so in this text, it says that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Now, that's a countercultural statement. Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. Jews would circumvent Samaria, culturally speaking. So this is a missional impulse. And so I think the question for us today is, knowing that this is the climate reality, where do we have to go? And it may be different. Again, like I was saying, like learning a different way of doing life at the micro level, much less than advocating for a different way of life at the macro, at the policy level. And how do we as faith communities stop circumventing these Samarias and our call and our mission, and start going straight through them? Even if, like Jesus, we get tired out by the journey, even if, like Jesus, we get worn out by the journey, and even if like Jesus, we have to be vulnerable and say, we're thirsty, give us something to drink. We don't know what we're doing, right? So that's one way. We could imagine this as though we're the Jesus who's going through, and climate change is the Samaria, and we have to kind of think through that, and we have to do that with humility, with vulnerability. I mean, that's a fascinating part of this Jesus, of this aspect of Jesus. Like here he is talking to a Samaritan woman and making his needs known. But the other one is to wonder, actually, what if we, the North American church or our faith communities, are actually the woman at the well? And this is something new that I've never thought about till just this morning, and I was thinking about this. I mean, what if the Jesus who had to go through Samaria is actually the Jesus from Central America, and because of the push of climate change is having to go? And what if we are the woman at the well? We have access to resources, and yet we're spiritually bankrupt. We're lonely. We're so individualistic that we fraction each other off based on things that will not matter in this ever shrinking globe, right? I mean, the things that cause the Samaritan woman to be marginalized, like, will matter so little. But what if we're the ones who are being visited by Jesus, and Jesus is saying to us, I thirst. I mean, the first glimpse I got to this, and you and I have talked about this, is in you're in LaGrange, where I guess you grew up and I lived most of my life, was when I realized that there were some policies that were denying access to the Jesuses and the Marias in our community to water. It was a post 9/11 policy change. And what was happening is that the city runs its own utilities service. And I thought that was super progressive. And they would also tout that because they run their own utility services, they have no property tax. But the reality is that twofold, is that even under the best circumstances, the utility structure without any property tax actually has a regressive nature to it, meaning that the poorest in that town pay a significantly higher percentage of their income to the city coffers. And that's even if you imagine that everyone had the same level of energy efficiency, which is not true, right? So the poorest, who are living in homes that have no insulation, who have really poor single pane windows, old air conditioning units, and whatnot, even if they set their heat at 68 degrees in the winter, they're going to pay a lot more in real dollars and a whole lot more as a percentage of their income. And so therefore that structure that we rely on for our comfort, those of us who are privileged rely on for our comfort, was becoming a regressive burden upon the poor. But then what I was realizing was that sometime after 9/11, the city changed its policies and said to even obtain access to water and other utilities, you had to provide a valid Social Security number. Thus, this was in effect disproportionately marginalizing and pushing out immigrants of various statuses who could not comply with this, but yet who nonetheless were educating their children, were doing their shopping, doing their, employed and paying their rents or mortgages in this very community. But we're being told that water, something that I remember Martin Luther King Jr. didn't even understand why we were even charging people for water, like how we could even commodify, water. But now how we were even subjecting some people to saying you cannot even have access to that. And so what if the Jesus who's saying, give me a drink, is actually the migrant in our midst who's saying, I spent countless years planting your coffee beans, making pennies per pound so that you could go to the big corporate drive-through window and pay $4 or $5 for something that I got pennies off of. I got hit by climate change. I got hit by drought. I got hit by these hurricanes that are even brewing, even this, as we speak in Central America. I got hit by fungus, and I learned in my culture that the way to sustain my family is through migration and remittances. And now you're telling me that I can't have access to water. Give me a drink. Because if you knew the gift, right? Instead, we operate out of a theology of scarcity and a culture of scarcity and a culture of fear. And so we've got to put up the walls, whether they're the social, political walls, or whether they're the walls in our hearts or the walls in our policies. We put up all of those walls so that we can continue to consume, and we can somehow continue to dehumanize those who live on the underside of our consumption.
Yeah.
That Jesus is tired out, and he sits down and he says, give me a drink. And he prophetically says, to the women, and that's why I think in this context, and this is new for me, I think to us says, if you only knew the gift and who it was asking you, I would give you living water. Like I would give you a water that can sustain all of us. And I think about that, and that's why I said I started with Arturo and Norma and the immigrants who lived with us, who taught us so much about what it meant to live in right relationship with one another, and what it meant to live in right relationship with our natural environment. Not that they were experts. I'm sure, I know that, in Guatemala, pesticides and fungicides are used, on the plants that produce our coffee in ways that just maximize the yield, but they don't know, an alternative, or they can't find the economic tipping point to switch to any other alternative. But they understand like what it means to reduce, what it means to reuse in super creative ways, and they don't really get to recycle just because they don't have the infrastructure, but they understand the reduction and the reuse in ways that we never even think of. I remember those 3 R's aren't just meant to be alliterative, they're meant to be sequential. I mean, I think that it was like a light bulb to me when I realized, when someone taught me that it's actually the first thing we have to do is reduce our consumption, and then reuse everything and anything that we have as much as possible. And then finally, recycle what little we have left over from that. So, yeah.
Well, Anton, no, this is all really great. Thank you for that. We're coming towards the end of our time, but I want to ask you, after kind of that beautiful illustration of the passage and kind of making the links between immigration, migration, climate change, spiritual discipline, what do you think are the ways in which individuals and faith communities can engage in a way that can help ensure that more just systems are put in place for immigrants and migrants sort of bearing the brunt of climate change that arguably we have helped perpetuate more than any other nation around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think at the burning bush, God says to Moses, I've seen the misery of my people. I've heard their cries on account of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and therefore I will come down and liberate them. And I've taken that to be kind of like a developmental process of what kind of holistic solidarity could look like. So depending where the listener is, or the viewer, or the congregation, or the place of worship is, that first step may just be, how do we have our eyes opened? Like, what does it take for us to see the world around us in a different way? And you and I collaborated recently, for example, with Chattahoochee River Keepers, and that might be one way, like connecting with them and the ways in which they teach about, at least those of us who are in the Chattahoochee, watershed, teaching about, and having us see those eyes, having our eyes open. And then the next is hearing, right? And most of the time, our North American privileged impulse is that when our eyes are open, then we want to go do, fix, build, like we want to go ahead and be the little messiahs. But this is a different kind of process. So once our eyes are open, the next step is to hear the cries. So how do we give voice to the voiceless? And so like what I would often do is host church groups or other groups, and we would sit down with migrants. I have one woman, one dear friend, Doña Berta, who, if you go into her backyard, you would think you have been kind of transposed into Guatemala. She's got a wood burning stove that she built herself. There's turkeys and chickens, and she's cooking, and we cook alongside her, making some Guatemalan tamales, and we just hear her story of migration. And then for those of us who might be attuned to kind of asking the climate change questions and the environmental questions, we could ask even like about the wood burning stove, and tell us about deforestation in Guatemala, and the way, like right now, that's perhaps with the heavy rains that are coming through right now, deforestation is probably what's going to put more lives at peril than, say, just the strong winds. It is the mudslides that could transpire. So hearing the cries, giving the voiceless agency and giving them a sense of voice, and then knowing their suffering. So with each of these, I can see from further away than I can hear. I have to get closer to hear, but then to know their sufferings, that's not a knowledge of the head, it's a knowledge of the heart. And it's the path of compassion. So I mean, what we just have to continue to do is get closer and closer to the other, because the other always bears the brunt of any of these intersectional issues. And then we can come down. Then we have the reason, the internalized reasons why we must come down, why we must displace ourselves, is kind of the Catholic term. And then that liberation is for all of us. I think liberation is for all. So I don't know if I have a pat answer other than to say, open one's eyes, learn as much as one can, but learn from the least of these, learn from those who bear the brunt of these systems, not just from the scholars. Listen to them, take leadership from them, develop a heart of compassion and interconnection and interdependence with communities that bear the brunt of this. And that will be our guide in what it means to displace ourselves and to find a liberation for all.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the last question that we've asked every guest on the show, which is, what are you missing the most in this COVID-19 world, and what's giving you hope to keep doing the work that you're doing?
I am missing community. I'm just missing, being able to be like, I'm developing, I'm not developing COVID fatigue. I am developing Zoom fatigue. I miss community. I miss the spontaneity of doing life together, and all the different aspects of being together in different cultural expressions, with music, with dance, with food, whatever you. But the thing that is sustaining me is that actually in the early on in COVID, and I was hearing how faith communities here in the South were rushing to say, we can meet in person, don't stomp on my freedoms, and all these type of things. I was curious, and I wondered how Southern churches responded to the Spanish flu. And I found a Methodist minister in Alabama, right? This is like 1918 or something like that. And the response of this minister is one that I've taken to heart, where the minister invited the congregants to embrace this time of a pandemic as a quote unquote unique Sabbath. And so that's what sustains me whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed, is just to kind of center myself again and say, what a gift this unique Sabbath is. And so that means me connecting more with nature. It means me consuming a lot less. All of the things that we're doing, all the things that we were saying. I mean, in the early days, wasn't the skies were more beautiful. I mean, everything, we could see like some of the immediate benefits of kind of slowing down our pace and lessening our carbon footprint and so on. And so that term, I've been using it all the time as a means to encourage others and as a means to remind myself that this is a unique Sabbath. And I would say it's unique Sabbath that science is saying we're reaching the end towards. The two first spikes in COVID, some would say were the hills, and now we're going over the mountains. So now is the time that we have prepared for in our unique Sabbath keeping, to really be sheltering in place, to really be using our masks, to really be social distancing. We just got to get over this big hill of the winter, and then thankfully, and hopefully science will then make it be so that we can once again return to a community of proximity.
Anton, thank you so much for coming on this morning and spending some time with us. I really appreciate it.